Hi, everyone. In this lesson, we're going to look at how threat actors get in. In other words, how do they gain initial access into our systems and networks? This is an important question because hackers can't just barge their way in. They have to exploit weaknesses in our systems, in our login processes, or even in our own psychology, which is how social engineering works. Understanding how hackers get in is also important because gaining initial access is the most difficult and most important step when it comes to compromising your entire network. Once an attacker gets initial access, they usually don't make themselves known or rush to complete their objectives. In many cases, an attacker will stay as silent as possible for months, learning about your systems and network, figuring out what is of the greatest value, and how to attack it. The first thing to understand is that while thousands of new exploits are identified in software and hardware systems every year, it's actually pretty rare for technically difficult attack chains to be used against small businesses. Instead, the vast majority of the time, initial access happens through social engineering, exposed servers or ports on the computers connected to our networks, and web application logins. Let's take a look at the first one, social engineering. The first method for gaining initial entry that we're going to talk about is social engineering. It includes attacks like phishing or business email compromise, which are the most common ways for hackers to gain initial access. It also includes scams. Social engineering is the use of psychological influence of people into performing actions or divulging confidential information. There are a couple of points I want to demonstrate on this slide. If you look at the image on the left, you can see Amazon results for a search on the term social engineering. I just wanted to show you that there are dozens of textbook quality materials out there that cover hundreds of techniques on social engineering and the psychology behind it. You need to know that social engineering is studied very seriously by cybersecurity practitioners, both the good guys and especially the bad guys. Social engineering is a real type of engineering, and we can definitely expect it to progress both as its own field of study and also as a tool used by hackers and scammers. A related point is that a lot of people think that people who get scammed or phished are just dumb or gullible. This is a common way of thinking when it comes to the general public, but I don't know anyone in the field of cybersecurity, especially penetration testers and red teamers, who get paid by companies to try and phish their employees. I don't know any cybersecurity experts who would say that they're successful because their victims are dumb or gullible. They're successful because they take advantage of basic human psychology. Really good social engineers are so skilled that they often don't need a computer. For example, DEF CON has a social engineering competition every year focused on vishing, or voice phishing over the phone. They get permission from the companies that they target, but in just a few minutes, contestants are often able to get a surprising level of access to the target company's resources right in front of a public audience. Here's some interesting statistics about social engineering. First, 94% of companies report being targeted by phishing efforts. We don't know how much the total cost is, but the average cost of data breaches that start with phishing was $4.88 million in 2024, according to IBM. Next, we have business email compromise, which is similar to spear phishing in that it's a highly targeted social engineering attack that involves email based impersonation. We have a statistic from the FBI that BEC attacks cost the US over $55 billion in 2024 alone. And finally, we have another statistic from the FBI that scams cost Americans $16.6 billion in 2024. On this slide, we're going to look at why social engineering works and why it's so effective. The first key point is that social engineering can be very compelling. It can be easy to spot bad attempts at phishing, but a targeted spear phishing campaign or email that comes during a sophisticated business email compromise attack can be much more effective. A lot of the time, hackers base their primary attack chain on social engineering, and they get really good at it. If you look at the phishing email on the right, it can be pretty hard to spot some of the telltale signs that this email is malicious. It looks really good and is virtually identical to an actual email from Home Depot. I like to compare social engineering to being similar to tricking someone into opening up the castle gates. It's just like the famous Trojan horse. If you can get the defenders to let you walk in, then the castle itself doesn't really do you any good. Similarly, social engineering attacks work on a technical level because they get around common defenses like antivirus and firewalls. There are a few reasons that social engineering is really good at defeating antivirus. One is that antivirus is really only capable of defending against malware that has already been seen in the wild. We'll talk about this later in a dedicated lesson, but the point is that it's surprisingly easy to make malware that successfully evades antivirus. Second, social engineering doesn't require malware at all. There are lots of attack patterns that are used today where the attacker doesn't use malware at all to gain access. So in this case, you can't even blame antivirus for not detecting malware because there's literally nothing for it to detect. The final 2 points that I want to make on this slide is that first, there are a lot of mitigations, and we'll work our way through many of them in the tasks in this course. Some of them will harden you against phishing, but others will also work in other ways by preventing attackers from going further. And, for example, escalating their privileges on our devices or pivoting through the network to compromise other devices. The last point that I want to make is that in terms of detecting and responding to phishing, the best tool is endpoint detection and response, or EDR. We highly recommend that small businesses look into a managed EDR service, or MDR. Again, we'll talk more about this in a future lesson, but just to make a quick point, the way that these solutions work is by collecting a huge amount of telemetry on your devices and then parsing that telemetry for indicators of compromise, which are telltale signs that something weird or bad is happening on your device. The second common way that hackers gain initial access is through external or exposed servers, services, and ports. This might seem a little technical, so I'll try to simplify it as much as possible. The image on the left shows a great tool called Nmap that I use to scan the TCP ports on a Windows computer. Nmap can be installed on either Windows or Linux, so you might want to take a look at that. In the image, you can see the port numbers in the left column. Then in the middle column, you can see that they all say open. In other words, these ports are open and are able to receive and transmit information. In the right column, we have the service type for each port. This type of scan is a really great way to do a quick survey of your network and discover what your computers are actually running. It's also the way that an attacker is going to do the same to try and identify open ports for them to target. Unless you've done this type of scan or paid someone to do a vulnerability assessment or a penetration test, there's a very good chance that you have open ports in your network or possibly even exposed to the internet that you don't know about. Websites used to be one of the most common ways that hackers gained initial access to business networks. This is becoming less common over time because most small businesses today use a hosting service, which shifts the attack surface from one that's on the small business's own server to a server that's living somewhere else in a data center. But some small businesses do still host their own websites, and these need to be very carefully guarded because if an attacker can gain access to that server, then they'll very likely be able to pivot directly into the network from there. But self-hosted websites are just the tip of the iceberg, and there are a lot of services that serve as great targets for threat actors. For example, network file shares are very common, and this includes any devices using File Transfer Protocol or FTP, Server Message Block or SMB, and Network File Share or NFS. Most small businesses use these, and if you're using Active Directory in particular to manage your Windows network, then you probably use SMB because it's used by default. Databases are another example. Most of the time, people aren't manually logging into the computer that houses the database. Instead, they're generally accessing their everyday computer and then using that to get to the database remotely. This means that your database is potentially open to attack. If you have a remote desktop enabled on any computer, the same thing applies. Keep in mind that many of these services allow brute force attacks, and unless you're running endpoint detection and response or a managed detection and response solution, you would never know that someone is trying to brute force their way in. The same thing goes for Windows Remote Management, or WinRM, which provides command line based access to Windows computers for remote admin. Finally, VPNs are very commonly used today in small business environments, and they are often vulnerable. The main reason is that a VPN is basically an internet accessible doorway right into your network, so they're extremely high value targets. A lot of people research VPNs to try and find vulnerabilities, so we get a lot of CVEs, which are publicly known vulnerabilities that can be exploited by threat actors if they're left unpatched or if there is an attack before a patch is available. When it comes to patching, there's a race between threat actors and defenders, so you need to make sure that you're managing it and not leaving yourself open to attack. Let's look at why these types of attacks work. The first point is that even though it's relatively easy to secure them compared to something like phishing, these types of services are often poorly protected. If you look at the image on the left, this is actually from a penetration test where we found that the client had an insecure FTP login that allowed anyone to log in anonymously. Anonymous logins, default guest accounts, and even null accounts with no username and password are actually pretty common at small businesses, typically because the best way to identify them is by using a vulnerability assessment or penetration test, and most small businesses never get one done. Underlying why these services are often poorly protected is the fact that most small businesses aren't cybersecurity people. They don't know how to scan their network or even how to see what's running on their computers, like we saw in the last slide. Even IT service providers are often unaware that various services are running on their clients' networks, and they're often shocked at the value provided by a quick vulnerability assessment. Similarly, a lot of apps that open ports are installed and then forgotten about. Maybe you enabled remote desktop at some point in the past, or you wanted to share files, and then you stopped using it and eventually forgot about it. Very often, these services are secured poorly because outside of cybersecurity staff, it's unlikely for anyone to know how easy they can be to target. Even non cyber IT folk often underestimate these types of attacks until they themselves get involved in a vulnerability assessment. So they're often unsecured, insecurely configured, or protected using weak passwords. Another point is that a lot of these services don't support multi factor authentication, or it can be difficult to configure it to use it. A great example of this is Remote Desktop, and this is one reason that we recommend using dedicated remote access software, also called an RMM, in many cases. The next point, and this is a big one, is that like any software, these services can be vulnerable to attack and exploited by threat actors as a result. After identifying what's running on your machines, the next thing that an attacker is often going to look at is, are any of these services vulnerable and are there known exploits? In most cases, from the defensive side, we can prevent this using patch management. But if you aren't actively performing patch management, there's a high chance that some of your software is vulnerable. If that vulnerable software opens a port on your machine to do its work, then you could be an easy target. For this last point, I just wanted to highlight that a vulnerability assessment is really the best way to find out what's exposed both externally to the internet and internally within your network. In a future lesson, we'll learn more about vulnerability assessments, including what small business owners should look for in a service provider and how to scope the assessment itself to gain maximum value. The third way that threat actors get initial access is by attacking web application logins. In today's work environment, we all use web applications pretty constantly. This is a good time to mention, just to put this somewhere in the back of your mind, that these are all examples of cloud services. So you may think that you don't use the cloud at all, since you've never signed up for an AWS or a Google Cloud account. But actually, web applications, when you're accessing a service, where you're accessing a service, whether it be email or even social media, those are all cloud services. So the most common web applications that virtually all small businesses use today are for email and productivity, and this includes Microsoft 365, Google Workspace, or even just Gmail. Next, many of us use scheduling and communication apps like Skype or Calendly or MailChimp to help us manage our email communication. File storage is extremely common. The main cloud providers like Microsoft and Google include this in their productivity suites, but third party software like Dropbox is also very common. We also use some type of financial and accounting applications. These include banking apps and applications like QuickBooks or TurboTax, but also payment processors like Stripe, Square, or PayPal. Next up are customer relationship management or CRM platforms like HubSpot, Salesforce, or Zoho. We also commonly use cloud and IT management services online directly. The big three are Google, Microsoft, and Amazon. Most small businesses have a website. That website gets hosted somewhere, like GoDaddy, Hostinger, HostGator, or DreamHost. So we have a login for that. And also, we need to log into the website in order to make changes and keep things updated. Small businesses often use a content management system or CMS, like WordPress, to help create a great looking website. WordPress is the most common CMS in the world, and you can see a standard WordPress login screen on the left of the slide. But there are other CMSs out there as well, like Drupal and Joomla. Some companies also use more fully managed services like Wix, Squarespace, or Dropify. Social media is a big one too. Virtually every company uses social media, and small businesses are no exception. A lot of small businesses use a Facebook page to establish an online footprint, which is easier and cheaper than making a website. It's also really common to use social media for marketing and communications. One thing to keep in mind when it comes to social media platforms is that generally you don't own the data that you store in them, it's in their terms and conditions. And since you're not a paying customer for most platforms, the service that you get is also very weak. So if something happens to your social media account, like you get locked out of it or data seems to have gone missing, don't expect the company to offer a high level of support and don't expect them to have made a backup of any data that you kept inside that platform. Finally, e-commerce platforms are also really common, with a lot of businesses doing some amount of sales online. There are industry specific platforms within a lot of industries that are basically full content management systems that include sales. And we also already talked about generic platforms like Wix or Shopify, but this also includes things like WooCommerce, which is a WordPress plugin. Let's look at why web application logins are commonly targeted and get some insights regarding what we can do about it. If you've been watching through this whole course, you're going to see some familiar terms, but I really want you to take away that each of these things apply to all of your logins, not just your banking app and your Windows login. The first point is that your login is your gateway to those services. When we use weak authentication on any one service, we're leaving it open to attack. The most common error is using weak passwords. This includes using passwords that aren't long enough. It also includes using old or breached passwords. The first thing that a threat actor is going to do is going to be to search for previously breached credentials in online databases. There's a great website where you can check called haveibeenpwned.com, which will do a free check for your email to see if it has been found in data breach databases. Password reuse is also extremely common and is very problematic because once a threat actor gets a hold of one working password, they're going to try it everywhere they can. Next is default credentials. This doesn't happen that much for publicly accessible applications, but it happens all the time on internal web applications, like those for routers and printers. You really need to check these to make sure that you aren't just using the default credentials. The next error is not using multi-factor authentication. MFA is the best and easiest way to help prevent brute force and password spray attacks. We'll get more into this, but MFA actually provides several means of protection in one single step. I want to stress that it's really hard to use strong unique passwords across every one of your accounts without using a password manager. So using a password manager is incredibly important, and it's one of the first tasks in this course. Let's quickly recap what we've learned in this lesson. First, attackers can't just attack literally anything. If you think of your IT footprint as being a castle, the castle has gates, it has windows, maybe it has sewers below. These are all the ways into the castle. Your castle also has people, and if the people can be manipulated into letting an attacker in, then your castle walls won't do any good. The point is that threat actors can't just attack you anywhere, they have to target specifically the things that they can. And just like you, threat actors have limited time and budget. So they prioritize the most likely weakest links. For example, they target people using social engineering. They target services that are exposed either to the entire internet or within your network. The best way to figure out what's actually open is by running a tool like Nmap, which we saw earlier, or getting a vulnerability assessment done. And they target web applications because they're accessible over the internet and often aren't as secure as people think. Finally, this lesson, is meant to be informative, not prescriptive. I talked about ways to make your system more secure, but we'll cover how to actually do this step by step in this course. Before we wrap up, I wanted to mention that this video is just one part of our free small business cybersecurity course available on our website. The course combines background articles with hands-on tasks, guiding you step by step to strengthen your security posture. Right now, it includes dozens of resources, and it's growing all the time, with everything organized in one place for you to follow. You can check it out at guardianangelit.com/small-business/cybersecurity.